Thank you, everyone, for coming. We may have a few more folks coming in over the next few minutes. There's some various events around campus, but I wanted to welcome all of you here. My name is Melody Birkins. I'm an environmental studies professor. I'm the associate director for programs and research at the Dickey Center, and we are just starting off with an incredible fall program. Hopefully, you'll see it on our website. We are starting with a whole series on women in policy. And we are very lucky to have, starting this series, we're putting her right into the series, is Dr. Rachel Salzman. And Dr. Rachel Salzman is going to be talking with us, it's up here, on techno-diplomacy. Can US-Soviet space cooperation provide lessons for the US and Russian cooperation in the Arctic? This connects both at the Dickey Center. We have various pillars of focus. The 5 of them are security, gender, human development, the environment and the Arctic, and then global health. So this connects 2 very interesting ones, security and the Arctic, so we're very pleased to have her here. Dr. Salzman is a postdoc fellow at Georgetown University and a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Her primary research focuses on Russia and more broadly on BRICS, which most of you in this room may know, but some of you who are not in that world may understand is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. She's made particular emphasis on how this concept of BRICS fits into Russia's broader foreign policy strategies, and she researches the scientific cooperation between Russia and the United States and its interplay with political relations, which is, again, happening in the Arctic, happening around the world. It's a really timely for this to come to Dartmouth right now. In 2014, Dr. Salzman was awarded a Cosmos Scholars Grant and a Boren Fellowship for her dissertation research and language study in Moscow. Before beginning her doctorate, she worked as the assistant director for the EuroAtlantic Security Initiative at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She holds a BA in European History from the University of Pennsylvania, an MPhil from the Russian Studies in the University of Cambridge, and a PhD from Johns Hopkins. She's a member of the Younger Generation Leaders Network, where she co-chairs the working group on economics. And she is also, and I don't know what the term means, but 2016 EASI.
Which is the EuroAtlantic Security Initiative.
EuroAtlantic Security Initiative, Hereford Next Generation Fellow, and a mentor for this year's cohort 2016-2017 Stanford US-Russia Forum on Science, Technology, and Engineering. It's a working group, and she's cooperating with that. So as someone who's very interested in science, policy, and diplomacy, to have someone here talking about techno-diplomacy is exciting for me, also in one of our key areas of the Arctic at the Dickey Center. So with no more ado, I welcome Rachel Salzman.
Thank you all for coming. It's very exciting to see so many faces in the audience. I'm going to start actually with a brief video and then move more into the details of the presentation. So I highly recommend everyone watch the rest of that video. It comes from a 30th anniversary celebration of the ApolloSoyuz test project that happened at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. in 2005. And, hooray, no? Yes, awesome. And I showed it to you partly because I think it's a great video, and partly because it cues up very well what I want to talk about today. While the cooperation for ASTP, the ApolloSoyuz test project, was very much scientific, it also had profound political meaning and intent. This brought with it much fanfare, but also problems that are inherent in science cooperation and diplomacy. US-Soviet space cooperation was one of the hallmark cooperative programs of the Cold War era, but the picture was by no means quite as rosy as that little video suggested. As we today face another period of intense political turmoil with Russia, it's useful to think about how cooperation proceeded in that prior era and where the lessons might be applied forward to the great scientific and technological challenges of our age. My talk today will proceed as follows. I'm going to give a brief conceptual framework for the project to explain where it comes from. I'll then give an overview of the great debate that is animating my field at the moment, which is whether or not we are in a new Cold War. We'll then turn to a discussion of what I mean by techno-diplomacy, and finally the substance of the presentation, which are main lessons of US-Soviet space cooperation and what that means for US and Russia in the Arctic. And I'll conclude with some basic recommendations. I should say this is a very US focused presentation, which is to say it is from the US perspective. The recommendations are primarily for the US government and US policymakers. Yeah, so just keep that in mind. So what you see there is the EuroAtlantic Security Initiative, which is a project I was lucky enough to work on from 2009 until I went back to grad school in 2011. The smiling faces you see are a former Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey, former US senators, former US national security advisors, former director of the Russian Strategic Rocket Forces, and a variety of similarly eminent people from across the EuroAtlantic space, in addition to one very smiling note taker. The idea of US-Russian cooperation and cooperation in the EuroAtlantic space is, to me, a very personal story. I had the great fortune to work on EASY at a period when US-Russian relations and relations across the EuroAtlantic space were the best they had been since the Cold War. I worked on it from 2008 to 2011. As I said, 2008, I was working on a US-Russia project more specifically. This was a period that saw the reset. It saw a new arms control agreement. It saw a reasonably productive bilateral presidential commission. When I was working on these projects, I thought, finally, we have turned a corner. That, of course, proved not to be the case. And since the Russian annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine in 2014, US-Russian relations have hit a nadir not seen since the end of the Cold War, not even during the war with Kosovo in the 1990s or the war between Russia and Georgia in 2008. These are not happy times for US-Russian relations. And as someone who is devoted both professionally and intellectually to the idea of US-Russian cooperation and to the importance of a stable and productive US-Russian relationship, the collapse in relations forced me to think about how cooperation continues even when political relations are so thin as to be non-existent. In 2008, immediately following the war between Russia and Georgia, Rose Gottemoeller, who is now the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at State, but was then at the Carnegie Endowment, wrote the following. She said, "Now is the time to hold tightly to the superstructure of the US-Russia past relationship, but only in order to have a stable foundation to think about the future." Gottemoeller comes from an arms control place, and so she was thinking of traditional US-Russian and US-Soviet arms control agreements, notably START, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, and things like that. But the truth is, scientific cooperation is as much a superstructure of US-Russian and US-Soviet cooperation as is arms control, and in fact, it predates it. So it seems to me that if we're thinking about grabbing onto a superstructure to help us build towards a more stable future relationship, it makes more sense to think about solving common scientific problems than how many times we can blast each other to kingdom come. And so in looking to answer my prior question about where cooperation continues, I look to the history of US-Soviet scientific cooperation and to civilian space cooperation in particular, which was in many ways the Hallmark program. So let's take a step back for a second and talk about this big question of, are we in a new Cold War? And I should say that I am on record against this idea. In 2015, Matt Rodjansky, who's the head of the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I co-authored an op-ed arguing that we are not in a new Cold War, and in fact, we should not be using this term for the following reasons. Major geopolitical differences, that we are no longer in a bipolar structure. There are massive power differentials between what we would think of as the two adversaries, between the US and Russia. And there are other major players in ways that there weren't in the previous era. There are also profound domestic differences. Both the US and Russia are dramatically different than they were 40 years ago. And whatever problems we may have with current Russian leadership and their foreign policy and domestic policy choices, Russia is not the Soviet Union. Finally, there are much more open ties between the citizens, as my own list of Facebook friends can attest. And that suggests that the relationship at the popular level is much less closed than in the previous era. Nevertheless, there are things to be learned. In 2016, Robert Legvold published a book called Return to Cold War, which I initially thought I disagreed with. And I should say, as full disclosure, I was Bob Legvold's assistant for 3 years, and I have great respect for most things he does. But in reading more carefully, in fact, what he proposes is a very interesting idea. He discusses the idea of the Cold War as a model. And he looks to what he calls the model period, which is 1947 to Stalin's death in 1953, and draws out 5 major criteria, attributes that one could use to define the idea of Cold War. These are mutual recrimination, which is to say each side thinks that blame for the conflict lies entirely with the other party, an unwillingness to search for common ground, a belief on both sides that change in the relationship is not possible until you get an entire regime change in the other country, a compartmentalized approach to cooperation, which is to say you'll cooperate where you can, you'll cooperate if you need to, but that cooperation will not be cumulative and lead to a better relationship. And by contrast, a very infectious approach to conflict, which is to say conflict in one area of the relationship will cause trouble in all other areas of the relationship. And I think that this idea of a model is very useful, because if we think of it a model like we would think of any other model, and I have significant training in economics, and so I think of economics trainings where the first thing they tell you is we're abstracting away from all of this, but let's look at what it can teach us. The idea of the Cold War model applies. And so I would argue that as much as there are differences, there are serious similarities, and so it is an apt analogy and an apt model. For this talk, where I would want to say the main lessons are that cooperation is important, even if it's not going to lead to great returns or cumulative returns, and the critical role of scientific cooperation and people-to-people contacts. So what do I mean by science and politics and science diplomacy? You'll note that I chose the rather awkward term techno-diplomacy as opposed to the more traditional science diplomacy. The term comes from a 1989 book by Glenn Schweitzer, who works at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington. And here you have the main definition. For me, what I think is most important is the first part, which is the idea of cooperating even when you are cooperating on science, even when you have conflicting interests on those very scientific issues. And so I think that the idea of techno-diplomacy gets to this idea of scientific cooperation between adversaries in a more specific way than the general term science diplomacy does. As a final note, science diplomacy must be, and science cooperation must be exactly that. One expert that I interviewed while I was conducting research for this project said that cooperation is neither aid nor trade. Instead, it is ongoing and mutually beneficial for the professionals involved. While the politics are always there, politics are insufficient for maintaining cooperation. So I'm going to try and keep those in mind, and I'd like you to keep those in mind as we continue. All right, let's talk about US-Soviet space cooperation. What you see here is the crew from the ApolloSoyuz test project. I'm going to go through a brief history, the good bits, the bad bits, and the lessons. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957, it was known as it just sent a shockwave through the American body politic, and it became known as the Pearl Harbor of American science. It led to a bonanza of federal funding, including the founding and funding of NASA. And part of the reason that it was so controversial was that, or so sort of stirring in a way that I don't think a similar event would be now, is that the US was quite sure it was technologically advanced and ahead of the US in the space race, and by corollary, missiles. And the fact that the Soviet Union got Sputnik up first was terrifying. All that having been said, however, the countries also began cooperating, or at least promising to cooperate, from very early on in the space age. This was in part, though, because both sides found it politically useful to employ cooperative rhetoric. For the US, it was very important to appear to be in favor of collaboration because it upheld the image of the United States as politically and scientifically open, in contrast with the closed system of the USSR. On the Soviet side, then General Secretary Khrushchev was hoping to prevent renewed military confrontation with the West for a variety of domestic political reasons, and as a result, he strove to frame the new Soviet superiority in space as a reason to expect softer policies from the United States and therefore a better relationship between the superpowers. The result was that almost from the beginning, you have competition and cooperation intertwined in the US-Soviet space relationship. Over the course of the nearly 30 years of cooperation, and of course it continues to this day under the guise of US-Russian space cooperation, although that is much more multilateral than it was in the early years of the US-Soviet relationship, you had some very big advances and very big successes. From a scientific perspective, the Joint Working Group on Space Biology and Medicine, a group that still functions under a different name, put out multiple volumes of research and made significant advances in telemedicine. These advances proved useful not only for the astronauts and the cosmonauts in space, but for the provision of medical care during emergency situations here on Earth, such as a catastrophic earthquake in Armenia in 1988. And you can see there a picture from the BBC of the devastation that earthquake wrought. The JWG is also a great example of a productive bilateral scientific project that had important and positive spillovers in the scientific realm. Beyond biology, US and Soviet scientists also cooperated to great success on lunar mapping, and joint lunar studies were successful because they were structured around exchanges of data that neither side had access to on their own. Beyond the scientific, you also had increased people-to-people contacts, kept open lines of communication, even during the darkest days of the Cold War. When the formal agreement governing scientific cooperation lapsed in 1982, you did have the continuation of some smaller projects. I'm going to come back to this in a second. I'm not sure what you said. It's okay. I'm going to come back to that later from the other side, but it is worth noting that there were projects that continued, and American and Soviet scientists themselves wanted to continue and found these useful. At a broader level, there's of course the kind of bigger issue of transnational networks and their role in ending the Cold War. The most famous of these is probably Pugwash, which was about nuclear disarmament. And I would argue that US-Soviet space cooperation, while governmental and therefore not quite the same thing, can be thought about in a similar way. Which brings us then again to the ApolloSoyuz test project, which for me is a really good link between the good and the bad. On the good side, as we saw in the video at the beginning, that so-called handshake in space was the culmination of 3 years of cooperation, of joint training of cosmonauts and astronauts, and the creation of a universal docking system designed to help any spacecraft assist another if it was in distress, regardless of that spacecraft's country of origin. ASTP was also a public relations bonanza. All of the American news networks covered live the event, the docking itself. You can still find the clips on YouTube. They're fascinating, including weird little models that ABC came up with. It's great. Oops, sorry. And industry got involved also, creating ApolloSoyuz cigarettes that were sold here and in Russia, and stamps. I can't imagine a similar event getting this kind of coverage and this kind of buy-in from all sectors the way ASTP did in the 1970s. The notion, however, that ASTP opened a crack in a closed relationship and that it happened during the darkest days of the Cold War, which is what one of the astronauts who's interviewed a bit later in that video says, is basically not true. One of the reasons ASTP was able to go forward was because the 1970s was détente, and it was a period of reasonably good US-Soviet cooperation in all areas. It wasn't a great relationship. We were still in the Cold War, but it was better than it was in the 80s or the early 50s, for example. And so that is something that's very important to keep in mind. because planned follow-up to the handshake in space never went forward because of declines in the political relationship. And this gets to a key point. As important as US-Soviet space cooperation was in the bilateral relationship in both scientific advancement and in maintaining open lines of communication, it was not a panacea. When political relations declined, space cooperation was an easy target for US politicians wishing to demonstrate their displeasure with the other side, and for Soviet politicians as well. Space cooperation worked best, therefore, when political relations were on a more positive trajectory. By the end of the 1970s, when political relations and détente had collapsed under the weight of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, domestic developments in the United States, and in the early 1980s, the imposition of martial law in Poland, you saw a lapse in the agreement that had governed US-Soviet scientific cooperation and space cooperation for over a decade. As I said, some stuff continued during the lapse, but the politics were such that you could not overcome them to continue scientific cooperation on a formal basis. Therefore, science can be a stabilizing force, but that is only true if there is political will to allow it to continue unencumbered by politics. And of course, one could make an apt analogy to the current crisis in Ukraine and its effect on all areas of US-Russian cooperation now. You'll see I have another tiny bullet point there, major technological fears. Part of the reason that space cooperation diminished when the rest of the relationship became more negative is that the overall decline in relations made louder the voices of those who had always been opposed to cooperation. Throughout the Cold War, the question of scientific cooperation with the Soviet Union was very controversial for a variety of reasons, but especially because of the question of technology transfer and the use of dual-use or sensitive technologies. There were ongoing concerns that cooperation with the Soviets would give them too much information about US technological advancements, and that information could then be applied in less peaceful arenas. Similarly, it was generally felt that the US was well advanced of the Soviet Union in technology and other similar related areas, and therefore there were questions as to whether scientific cooperation was more beneficial to the Soviets than it was to the US. So if we think about the good and the bad, we can get to the lessons. In 1985, the now defunct Office of Technology Assessment on Capitol Hill put out a report on US-Soviet space cooperation, and for that report, they spoke with American scientists who had been engaged in cooperative scientific projects with the Soviets. And these scientists came up with three basic lessons. The first of these is think small. Data exchanges, something like lunar mapping, works much better than something like ASTP. And this is primarily because of bureaucracy. If you're doing a joint mission, you get to the questions about technology. It has to be cleared through 18 levels of politics and sort of departments, and it's much more difficult. If you're sharing data or you're working kind of along the same track but not officially together, it's easier to get that project going. The next is to find complementarities. If you'll recall, I said at the beginning that science must actually be science, neither aid nor trade. This falls under a similar category. One of the reasons that the Space Biology Working Group did so well is because the Soviets had much better information on the effect of long-term spaceflight on, for example, cardiovascular health. This was information that US scientists didn't have, and so cooperation on this area was beneficial for US scientists. Cooperating where both sides bring the same thing to the table was not helpful and was not beneficial from the perspective of the scientists interviewed by the OTA. And similarly, it's important to have clear scientific objectives, and this again gets into ASTP. ASTP began as a political project. It was something that it was proposed by then NASA Administrator Tom Paine, and the Soviets went with it because it was useful to them, right? The idea of saving their cosmonauts should there be problems. But at the end of the day, it was a politically motivated project, and as impressive and as important as it is in the history of US-Soviet scientific cooperation, politics is not enough to sustain cooperation. There needs to be a reason for it to keep going. And so then this leads to what I hope, if you take nothing away from this talk, that you take away the following. While politics and scientific cooperation can never be entirely decoupled, in tough political times, and probably in all political times, let the science lead, and let the scientists figure out where cooperation makes sense. So moving to the Arctic, I chose this picture, in fact, for a reason. It's a picture from NASA, and so I thought that linked nicely from the previous discussion of the Soviet space relationship. But it's a picture of melting ice in Greenland, which is, of course, one of the major concerns and one of the major areas we think about in terms of reasons to cooperate in the Arctic. So let's talk about this. Is the Arctic the new space? During a speech at GW in Washington, D.C., in April of this year, Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, who's chair of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, referred to the Arctic as the new space. And I, for one, agree that it is an apt analogy. The Arctic is one of the most significant scientific and technological challenges of our age, and it is one that is best approached cooperatively. Nevertheless, the region raises many fears about competitive fears that the space race stoked during the Cold War. Among NATO allies, there are persistent fears about perceived Russian militarization in its Arctic zone. And as the region warms, previously inaccessible resources, everything from hydrocarbons to fish, may stoke competition not only among Arctic powers, but among other major trading states. Already, the littoral Arctic states have submitted claims about the extent of their continental shelf to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, other than the US, which has claims but is not part of it because it has not ratified UNCLOS, which I'll talk about in a second. These claims are overlapping, in particular between Denmark and Russia. You can't quite see it here, but essentially Russia and Denmark are kind of fighting over that bit over there. And to the extent, and so the Commission is going to take it a very long time to reach its decisions. And those decisions will be based on geology and science and various other fun things that we like to think are indisputable. Nevertheless, if a country feels that that the findings do not go its way, there is a risk that that country could go outside accepted international law in handling it. All that having been said, of course, there are major differences, and it's worth outlining those briefly. First of all, the Arctic is primarily a multilateral region at this point, and that is the same for its governance, for its scientific cooperation, and things like that, whereas outer space for most of the previous century remained a primarily bilateral concern for the US and the Soviet Union. In addition, the Arctic is governed by a much clearer international legal regime than was space in its early years. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, makes clear the basic rules of the road in the Arctic, and while there are ambiguities and there are disagreements over some elements of its application, it mostly works. And even though the US has not ratified UNCLOS, it tends to mostly abide by it. And I would note that every president since Reagan has suggested that we should ratify UNCLOS, so it's controversial, but it is something that we tend to follow. And finally, the Arctic Council, which celebrates its 20th anniversary this year, has been an effective organ of governance in the region. And while debates continue over either extending the Council's competencies or transitioning it to a more formal institutional structure, the fact remains that the Arctic Council allows all of the Arctic states to sit as equals and cooperate on issues of mutual concern. Nevertheless, I do think that you can still take the idea of a model and think about how the lessons in space apply to the Arctic. With one important caveat. As I said, the Arctic is primarily multilateral. This talk, as you've seen, is structured as a US-Russia talk. The same will continue during the section on the Arctic, but I think that the recommendations I put forward are as applicable to a multilateral context. So even though I won't be talking about the positions of the other members of the Arctic Council, they need to be taken into account, and the recommendations I come up with at the end will fit that context as well. So let's look first at Russia in the Arctic, and then the US, challenges to cooperation, and finally recommendations. So what are Russia's priorities in the Arctic? Russia has basically 3 priorities in the Arctic, and these are security, economic development, and sovereignty, national sovereignty, державность. I'll get back to that in a second. On the first point, the security question is actually fairly straightforward. The majority of Russia's nuclear fleet is headquartered in Murmansk, and the Arctic provides Russia's only northern access to open water, which, yes, you can see on this map-ish. So for both of those reasons, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was actually the Soviet Arctic was a closed region, and it was not until Mikhail Gorbachev's Murmansk speech in 1987 that the idea of East-West cooperation on the Arctic really got going. While much of the Russian Arctic was neglected for the first decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has regained importance in recent years, and the current Russian government has invested heavily in modernizing the military and defense infrastructure in the Russian Arctic zone. And you see some of this here with new air bases and fun things like that. Some of that infrastructure modernization, however, may not be motivated entirely by security concerns, though I would point out that this is a major point of contention between analysts, both Russian and Western. The reason for the uncertainty gets to Russia's second main priority, and that is economic development. There are two parts of this, and these are resource extraction and use of the northern sea route, which I apparently forgot to make a bullet point for. Much of the modernization of the bases and such that we're seeing is also related to improving search and rescue capacity within the Russian Arctic zone, which again is helpful for getting ships to use the northern sea route, which is very expensive. And Russia would like more ships to use the northern sea route. Also, as Marlene Laruelle points out, the Russian military is the group that has the budget and the know-how to oversee this kind of logistical project. So there are absolutely reasons to have serious questions about Russian military actions and activity in the Arctic. It's also maybe dangerous to read too much into it. On the question of resource extraction, this is a priority that actually conflicts somewhat with the security question, because both for technological and economic reasons, Russian energy companies will have to partner with foreign companies in order to best exploit Russia's Arctic resources. Current low commodity prices make this a somewhat moot point. There was also something that WWF Russia recently put out that Russia has put a hold on Arctic drilling. It's not clear how that'll play out, and Russia is still actively exploring. The other major important point on this, though, is that the question of drilling is the one place that Ukraine has really hit the US-Russian relationship in the Arctic. Some US and European sanctions directly target technology for resource extraction in the Arctic, and while this has not yet proved a hindrance to other Arctic issues, it could, and it's worth keeping in mind. I would argue, though, that the real challenge to cooperation in the Arctic is the way that the Arctic plays into Russia's conception of national identity, national sovereignty, and державность, which is this idea of great poweredness, of being a great power, and it is a word that just has terrible English translation. And here we get to the issue of conflicting Russian rhetoric on the Arctic. I think I mentioned before that for the most part, the Arctic powers, the members of the Arctic Council, have been very clear that they see the Arctic as a zone of peace, as a zone of cooperation, and as a place where that cooperation should continue regardless of everything else that's happening, and regardless of even concerns about military operations in the Arctic. Russia is in that boat, kind of. It basically presents two faces on the Arctic, and honestly on its foreign policy in general, its foreign policy rhetoric in general. You have a cooperative face and a combative face, and that is probably best exemplified by these two delightful Russian politicians. You have Sergei Lavrov, who's the Russian foreign minister, and Dmitry Rogozin, who's a deputy foreign minister, and the Arctic is part of his remit. Lavrov comes out with generally cooperative, generally useful statements. Rogozin, less so. During an unsanctioned trip to Norway last year, or right afterwards, he tweeted that the Arctic is Russian Mecca, which is not terribly helpful in thinking about US-Russian or Western Russian cooperation in the region. Now, it's worth noting that Rogozin is a particular flavor of politician, and Western Russia watchers tend to understand that he plays a certain role in the Russian political ecosystem. Nevertheless, concerns remain that should political relations deteriorate further, Rogozin-style rhetoric could translate into policy more readily. It hasn't yet, though, and we can always hope. The United States in the Arctic is very different than Russia in the Arctic. This is partly because we have a much less developed sense of Arctic identity. In the lower 48, the Arctic has simply historically not really been an issue. That's changing with increasing focus on climate change in the region, as well as fights over Arctic drilling, but it is changing slowly. However, under President Obama, the US has focused on the Arctic like never before. Obama was the first president to send cabinet-level officials to an Arctic Council meeting that happened in 2011 for the signing of the Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement. And in 2015, in August, he became the first sitting US president to visit the Arctic. Some of the focus likely comes from the fact that the US currently holds the rotating chair of the Arctic Council, but some also comes from Obama's own interest in climate change and environmental conservation. The US currently has two sets of priorities with regard to the Arctic. The first are the national priorities, and the second are the priorities that we have articulated as part of our chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Where I would have you focus is on two issues. The first is the extent to which they do seem to differ from Russia's. Here you have much less emphasis on hard security and much more emphasis on the environment, on indigenous communities, things like that. And the other issue, which I think is much more relevant to the talk today, or linked, but I would emphasize for the talk today, is the extent to which they are focused on scientific and technological issues. For the Obama administration, the Arctic is very much a scientific challenge, and Ambassador Brzezinski said as much during his speech in April in Washington. The Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which was founded by President Obama in January of 2015, is based in the White House Office of Science and Technology, not in, for example, the National Security Council. And on September 28th, next week, the White House will host the first ever White House Science Ministerial. This is not to say that we don't have hard security concerns in the Arctic, but they are not the primary focus of our strategy and of our policies. And under current US leadership, the focus is much more on softer security concerns and scientific challenges that can only be addressed collaboratively with other Arctic partners. And I would say that this is good news for US-Russian scientific cooperation in the region. Hang in there, we are getting to the end. So I hope that you take a lesson away from here, that cooperation in the Arctic between the US and Russia and between the West and Russia is possible and even likely. That does not mean, however, that it is easy or that it is without its challenges. First and foremost, there's the issue of how the US and Russia prioritize their interests in the Arctic. And I got to that somewhat in the previous slide, but it's worth drawing out more clearly. Having shared interests is only half the battle. Each side also needs to care enough about a given topic in order to mobilize and expend the necessary resources, both financial and otherwise, in order to make the project happen. When it comes to the Arctic, the US and Russia see things a bit differently. The US is very focused on the environment and on climate change, and Russia is less so. This is not to say that Russia does not have serious environmental concerns with regard to its Arctic region. It just tends to be less invested in addressing those and working on them in the same way that that is very much the focus of US Arctic policy. And this mismatch can make getting a project started somewhat complicated. The bigger issue, though, is that of uncertainty, which is our joyous topic of the US presidential elections. Election years are notoriously bad for US-Russian relations, and this year has proved no different, even though, for the first time, Russia is not on the same presidential election cycle. Compounding the general problem of election years is that the US candidates this year are by no means traditional. Clinton is deeply unpopular in Russia, which makes it hard to envision how cooperation with Russia would continue under her presidency. On the other side, her policies are well laid out and reasonably predictable, both on the Arctic and on the environment and on US-Russian relations. On the other hand, Trump has evinced an admiration for Putin. They seem to have something of a bromance going. But he's also very unpredictable, making speculation about any of his policy choices, whether the environment, where he has not really said very much and what he has said has not been encouraging, but we never know, or about US-Russian relations, or about cooperation in the Arctic, very problematic. We just don't know and we can't really predict it. To the extent that we can extrapolate the lesson of needing a sort of upwardly trending relationship for positive scientific cooperation, the current situation and the uncertainty of the candidates in the election year does not really bode well. I think we'll muddle through, we tend to, but it's worth keeping in mind. Final slide, guys, get excited. So, what have we learned? The challenges notwithstanding, the Arctic remains perhaps the most promising arena for US-Russian and Western Russian scientific cooperation. There are fewer competing interests in the Arctic than there are in other areas, and most of the challenges are common to all. So how can we take the lessons from US-Soviet space cooperation and apply them to the Arctic? I have a few ideas. The first is do no harm. You'll remember that or you may not remember, but under US-Soviet space cooperation, the first recommendation was the idea of think small. I've taken that forward a bit to think about the stuff that we already have going. There are small projects on the environment and on the Arctic that happen between the US and Russia now. And I would say that from the perspective of being a political scientist and someone who's just looking to keep open lines of communication in a lot of ways, not killing those projects is a recommendation in itself and is worth thinking about. They're not expensive, they're not gonna solve the relationship in any way, shape, or form, but they're useful, and killing them would do more harm than keeping them open costs. The second is let science be the guide, and I cannot hammer this one home enough. As I said, I'm a political scientist. I don't come at this with a hard sciences background. So when I think about let science be the guide, what I mean is how do politicians and policymakers facilitate an environment where scientific cooperation can happen? And that can mean getting out of the way. That can mean making sure that there aren't hindrances to visas or that travel to Russia doesn't need to get cleared by one or another government body. That can mean making sure that there is funding available. There's a wide variety of ways where even those of us who are not doing the hard science can make it easier for the science to happen. And I would say that this is a major issue. So it is about letting the science be the guide, but it's also about thinking for those of us not in the sciences about how we make that happen. And finally, it is critically important to have clear and mutually beneficial scientific objectives. Cooperation for cooperation's sake is great, but it doesn't really lead anywhere, and neither side is all that motivated to keep it going. So there are a few areas where both the US and Russia have talked about needing to make improvements in their Arctic areas. These include telecom, mapping, which the US is doing its own project on, but I would imagine there's some level of possibility for overlap, and also infrastructure, considering both sides have big issues with infrastructure as a result of melting permafrost. Those are a few ideas. Scientists could come up with better ideas, but the idea is to make sure that the cooperation is happening in a way that the scientists themselves feel invested and feel that they are gaining from the project. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. And we have about, I think, 10, 15 minutes for questions, I hope. And let me just point out that our Institute of Arctic Studies director is just back from Russia with scientific cooperation with the UArctic, which is connected and also works the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, which is connected to the Arctic Council and working on scientific issues of mutual benefit. So Dartmouth has a real, and the Dickey Center is really working on these issues closely. I have so many questions, but we're going to talk later. So I'm going to open up and say, does anyone have any questions for Rachel?
And if you could just tell me who you are when you ask your question, I would really appreciate it.
And if you wouldn't mind, actually, if you wouldn't mind, I'm just to repeat their question, just it'll help with the microphone.
Hi, I'm Sabrina. I'm a postdoc here at the Dickey Center. Thank you very much for your talk. It's very, very interesting. So I have two questions, and they're more generic and they have less to do with the Arctic. Okay. So I was wondering, because this topic is very new to me, if you thought about kind of the conditions under which scientific cooperation works more broadly. So I was thinking of it more as like in a thematic way. So space cooperation works, but obviously atomic energy didn't work. Maybe didn't work during the Cold War. I don't know. Maybe there was cooperation. today, maybe cooperation on science in the Arctic works, but maybe not in artificial intelligence. So like how do we draw the boundaries for which scientific issues might work for cooperation? And then the second question has to do with funding. So obviously a lot of science funding in the US is funded by the government. And does that impede cooperation in any way? If you think that funding is going to be tied to certain types of innovation for the military, for example, right? So.
Should I cluster them or do one at a time?
I don't know. I will let you choose how to do that.
Well, those are both fairly dense, so I will go with it and give you all time to think of brilliant questions while I'm answering. So those are great questions. And I actually think they both have a similar answer, which is to say the same problem that we ran into in space cooperation of sensitive technologies is not only applicable to space cooperation, right? So there are going to be areas where scientific cooperation, whether with Russia or frankly with any other country that we don't have some kind of extensive military alliance with, is going to be really difficult. That doesn't mean, though, that there are not areas where we can cooperate. I'd also point out that I focused on US-Soviet space cooperation because it's the one that I think is the easiest to latch onto because it's the most famous. There was very productive US-Soviet health cooperation. The smallpox vaccine came out of the Soviet Union, and cooperation in eradicating that was one of the most successful projects. There was similar cooperation on polio, things like that. So there will always be areas. And I think it's also a question of weighing the risks, right? So research into vaccines, right, obviously gets into, especially now, the question of weaponizing, right? And so if you're cooperating on eliminating a disease, are you then opening yourself up to someone seeing your research into how you would weaponize? You can play this forward in any number of areas. You're eventually going to do a cost-benefit analysis, right? And you're going to figure out, is it worth it? And I would say probably yes, but I come from political economy, not international security. So on the funding issue, it's actually even broader than that. I didn't mention it as much in this talk because there was enough in there already. But a lot of the hindrance to US-Russian scientific cooperation, or frankly scientific cooperation in general as I understand it, is money. If there is money for something to happen, then it is much more likely that it will happen. At the moment, there is much less money for things to happen, and this is especially true in the Russia area, not only on science, but in general. In terms of the fact that it's government funding, I'm less sure that that would itself be a hindrance, but that's also because Russia has its own quite complicated laws on how stuff gets paid for. So it's not clear that that would be the primary impediment.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm also a postdoc here at Dickinson on the security side of things. You made these intriguing comments throughout, so I just wanted to push you to clarify a little bit, I think. So one of them was that science is something that we like to think is indisputable, right? And so you're sort of bringing into question the objectivity of science, right? But then you also say that politics is not enough to sustain cooperation. So what I kept hearing you think was that science is something special, but I'm not clear why you think it's special, what you think it does that politics can't do. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. So I think science is special for two reasons. First off, it is something where if it goes well, both sides will just benefit, right? Like working together to get a vaccine is sort of an indisputable good, right? Whereas working together to re-talk through EuroAtlantic security architecture, which I do as a living, right, is something that I think is profoundly important, but you have much less evident kind of concrete spillovers. From an international cooperation perspective, I would say it's not that science is special so much that science is seen as a place that is international and is therefore an easier place to talk about getting cooperation started when politics are bad. So it's more about the aura of science rather than science itself being indisputable. Does that make sense?
Hi, Rachel Ross, Virginia Arctic Studies. Yeah, I just got back maybe 30 hours ago from Russia.
Thank you for staying awake.
Yeah, for one University of Arctic meeting. There was a lot of discussion about the current state of affairs between the U.S. and Russia. And at the opening of the conference, Russia's Arctic ambassador gave a welcome to the group and then read a message from Minister Lavrov. And the message was basically a reiteration of Gorbachev's speech about the Arctic as a zone of peace. And I would have to say then, throughout the rest of the Congress, there was quite a bit of discussion back and forth about where are we now. And then we jumped forward to talking about the White House Arctic Science Ministerial next week. And I just wondered how you felt, if you look at the way the Science Ministerial is set up, there's going to be maybe 30 nations approximately there. But there really, many people think of the Arctic as the Arctic 8 nations. And really the U.S. Arctic relationship has been forged around that core of 8 Arctic nations. And in a very short period of time, suddenly we have 30 countries calling themselves or having Arctic interests, like ministerial with India, China, Singapore, Korea. So how do you think the influx of these other nations who are now calling themselves Arctic nations, right, because they don't want to be left out, but how do they now influence the U.S.-Russia relationship? And what do you think the outcome of this ministerial will be?
Thanks for throwing me an easy one there.
Yeah, well, I want to know. Because here you go. Okay.
I think the question of access to the Arctic will be one of the major questions of global governance going forward. Much of my research is more about changing representation in organs of global economic governance. But some of the same principles apply, which is to say that when the Arctic was primarily frozen over, I mean, it's still frozen over, right? But when you had much less possibility of access, people were less interested. At the point that you have major resources that are not definitively in an exclusive economic zone, right? And a lot of them are, right? Which I think gets lost in the talk, right? And so it is important to say, like, a lot of the resources that people talk about being up for grabs are not in fact up for grabs. There are some, though, right? And I think that there will have to be a serious discussion about what governance of the Arctic looks like, what the Arctic Council looks like, when there is a possibility for everyone to get to a global commons in the area. Between the US and Russia, there are some conflicts, right? So China, for example, is now an observer on the Arctic Council. Russia was very opposed to that. That, I would argue, has more to do with Russia liking to maintain elite standing in organs of global governance. Whatever one it is, Russia wants a seat and then doesn't want other people to want a seat because it thinks of things in a more kind of great poweredness way, essentially. So blocking access to observing and to membership in the Arctic Council is part of that, as opposed to kind of specifically being against China, although that's probably part of it also. I think, whereas the US has taken a much more international approach. With science in particular and how the White House ministerial will play out, I would argue that next week people will play nicely, but it'll depend on how funding plays out, where complementarities are, and things like that. I actually don't think Russia will kind of cause a ruckus, but I do think that the broader question about access to the region and governance in the region and conservation of the region is something where we've been kicking the can a bit, and we're not going to be able to at a certain point.
I'm Mark Solo, and I come from a political background rather than a scientific background. And I'm concerned that there appears to be an increasing number of people who don't think science is anything that we should honor, that we need to make decisions on other bases. And that view is filtering down into our education system. And I'm very impressed with your presentation, and it's the kind of presentation that I think school children should see and understand how important scientific cooperation can be. And I'm looking for ways to make that happen.
Thank you. And in terms of how that happens, I don't know. I was raised on the East Coast, right? I grew up in Manhattan. I live now in Washington, D.C., and have done for about 7 years, right? Other than that, I've lived in Philly and Boston. I have never lived somewhere where the feeling on science that you're describing is prevalent. And it is something that I struggle with a lot, not only in terms of what I, from my squishy science, think of as soft science, but facts in general, right? And all sciences and all disciplines have facts in general. But I think the best we can do is, make the reforms that need to be reformed and hope for the best.
And I will just suggest that the term science diplomacy, I love the fact that you mentioned it was kind of old school and now we're in techno-diplomacy, because science diplomacy is still an emerging term too, and so...
Techno-diplomacy is actually old school.
And then, thank you. So I was kind of playing with the idea that these are actually terms can even compete and have nuance to them, which is wonderful in my book. You start to define what they are, you start to think about their scope and what it means to be in that field, opens up new career pathways and bridges that we didn't have, what we had before, and now we're going to move into a new era. And I hope, again, based around cooperation, it's on the same path. Yeah. If any other questions, or I think we'll be here just for a few minutes, but thank you everyone, and thank you, Rachel.